So let's start the next few moments. We have an opportunity now to kind of engage Scott in a little bit of a dialogue. And so I have a microphone. We are recording this, by the way, so that other people who couldn't be here today will be able to see the video of this. And my thanks to the Port of Portland for their helping provide the videotaping services. It's going to be really helpful. But in that context, what I'd like to do is to capture your question on the audio with this microphone. So I will be Phil Donahue or Oprah Winfrey or somebody like that for a while. And if you have a question, raise your hand and I'll bring the mic over and you can ask Scott a question. And the senator gets the first question here.
Thank you. I guess in watching your presentation, Mr. Shapiro, all of us see the world through the prism where we live, and I was looking at some of your recommendations and just mentally rifling all of the enemies of those suggestions. A sales tax in this state, somebody will go get a rope. And so in thinking about how we move beyond the project level, but we move up to a policy level, do you have any advice for how we keep ourselves together, what forums we use to go into the legislature so that we're all speaking with one voice and we don't look like a box of mice somebody tipped over? I mean, we have different legal entities, we have different urban and rural concerns, and I'm just trying to think, how do we begin to get a policy discussion rather than the kind of project discussion that I think part of your presentation shared with us?
So I guess I have a number of thoughts. I have the governance type discussion, which Steve could probably run better than anybody here, about how you form yourself and how you come together. But I also think that probably you can have a dialogue on what the goals are. Has the community, have all of the communities come together to agree on what the goals here are? In California, and my apologies for having so many sentences start with "in California," but that's the base of much of my experience. In California, the state legislature told us that the urban areas would have a 200-year level of protection, and if they didn't, they would stop developing. That motivated an agreement on values. I'm not saying it was the right thing. In many ways it was the right thing, and in many ways it was the wrong thing, but it forced us to agree on values. I think Oregon's a little bit different in how it approaches issues, and it tends to be more collaborative. But the same kind of thing, a conversation on what is it we're trying to achieve. Let me give you an example. I don't know all of your geography well enough, and I don't know all of your particular circumstances. But I would guess there's at least one district here that has no employees or one employee. It has an annual budget that's $30,000 to $150,000 a year. It maintains 3 to 10 miles of levee, and it's been remapped. And it's saying, what in the world do I do? And you could get some expert in, engineering expert, who could do some quick calculations and say, yeah, I think we could solve your problem. It's a $20 million solution, okay? Well, at some point, the community should have a conversation. Is the solution good or bad? The solution is a great engineering solution. Is it the right solution for the community? A $20 million solution has a cost. The cost may be worse than the current problem. So that's where you have to start off with, well, what is it you think makes sense for your community? If the consequence of the hypothetical I made up, which probably aligns with at least one person in this room, is true, then in that circumstance, maybe there's a main street with 20 businesses, and you'd have 3 feet of flooding in those businesses in the event of an event. Well, it may be ridiculous to spend $20 million to protect that damage. It may be better for the community to come together and create some fund to fund flood insurance for those businesses. It may be better to say, we're going to elevate these homes instead. In Sacramento, there was a massive flood in 1852. They elevated the entire downtown by 1 story. What they did is I'm not suggesting you would do this as a solution, but what they did is they actually built walls. So you'd walk out of your front door, and about 5 feet ahead of you, there would be a wall. And they would do that on the other side of the street as well. And then in between the walls, they filled it up with dirt. So they raised the street by a story. And then from the wall over to the building, they put planks, which is the new sidewalk. And then the second story, they knocked out the window and put the door in. And the first story became a basement, and the second story became the first story. That was a really good flood solution at the time. It was far cheaper. It didn't prevent the floods from coming in, but everyone stayed dry for over 100 years as a result. So that's where you got to think about what the goal is. Sometimes I think we jump too quickly to an engineering solution before we talk about what is it we want to achieve. So in answer to your question, from a policy perspective, probably acknowledging that the right solution is going to be different for different communities. Some are going to engineer their way out of it. Some aren't going to engineer their way out of it, and we need to do something to make sure that the disadvantaged in those communities aren't harmed, and there are probably other solutions as well. That's where I would start.
Next question.
I'm Todd Dugdale, and I'm Land Development Services Director with Columbia County, and we have the longest stretch of the Columbia River in Oregon, and we have about 13 levees in individual small districts, which you just described with their capability. Our issue is we're in the mode of the threat of remapping. It's beginning to sink in. You said that that's the way to motivate people. Well, we're getting increasing motivation, but it's like the coach who gives the big impassioned halftime pitch to his team. They get all revved up, and then they find the doors locked to the stadium. There's some regulatory barriers, not so much even fiscal. As you say, there's some creative ways to work on that. But the non-competition provisions in federal law, the so-called Thomas Amendment, that requires us to get another federal partner with a 5% match in order to get the Corps involved in accreditation study, big thing for us. Are there any scenarios, any experience you've had with that in terms of locals dealing with that?
The experience that I've had with communities has generally been where the communities have turned to private engineering companies to do levee certification rather than the Corps. And it may be unique to some of the under-seepage issues we have, but the FEMA standard for certification is different than the Corps standard for certification when applied to many of the levee systems I'm familiar with. And the Corps standard tends to be a more conservative standard, requires a more robust solution. That's a great thing for providing flood protection, but it also is a tough thing when your project's already looking at $500 million. And so in those communities, we have looked to engineering companies to provide the certification and the private studies, and then we have handed the completed projects off to FEMA with local engineering certification of the levees. So I don't have a lot of experience with the issue you're identifying of finding a federal partner to work with you in order to go to the Corps to ask for certification studies.